I'm a very strong believer that when it comes to politics and our public institutions, integrity is critical. And in order to maintain integrity and trust, we need to have super strong whistleblower protections. Just prior to Christmas, there were reports that Richard Boyle may have been negotiating with prosecutors over a plea deal. If you haven't heard of Richard Boyle before, he's the guy that blew the whistle on the Australian Taxation Office. Richard Boyle is a whistleblower. That's something that the court accepts. In case you're not familiar with his work, here's a quick recap of his case. If you have seen this before, feel free to skip ahead using the chapter thing below. Richard Boyle worked at the ATO in Adelaide as a debt collection officer. His whistleblowing journey began in 2017 when he blew the whistle internally at the ATO after he identified what he alleges were unethical tactics being used for revenue raising. Boyle alleges staff were instructed to start issuing standard garnishee notices on every debt collection case. A garnishee notice is a debt collection tool that allows the ATO to order a bank to hand over money from a taxpayer's account without their consent. In other words, the ATO can issue a notice to your bank to siphon money from your bank account, clear your tax debts.
To summarise,
as this article in the Canberra Times says, think robo-debt but for small businesses. Richard Boyle first blew the whistle internally in October 2017, but his complaints were dismissed. So, in accordance with Section 7A of the Public Interest Disclosure Act, believing that his PID, or public interest disclosure, had not been handled reasonably, he took the matter to the Inspector General of Taxation and Taxation Ombudsman, or the IGTO. This again went nowhere. Exhausting the internal avenues, he went external to investigative journalist Adele Ferguson and Four Corners. You can still catch the 2018 episode of Four Corners on iView. The court has since determined that Richard Boyle's original PID, the one made through his efforts to blow the whistle internally back in October 2017, was not dealt with appropriately, and the authorised officer's decision to discontinue the initial inquiry was incorrect. I guess we can only speculate, sliding doors, but what would have happened had that initial disclosure been dealt with appropriately back in the day? Furthermore, 3 justices of the South Australian Supreme Court have recently said that the ATO accepts that the appellant is a whistleblower, as that term is commonly understood, and Richard Boyle disclosed information to an authorised person pursuant to the terms of the Public Interest Disclosure Act. Let's be real, the Commonwealth has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars prosecuting this guy so far because he had the cojones to speak out. Richard Boyle helped people. Dirk Fielding was one of those people. He was interviewed on 7:30. If you haven't seen it, check out the full story on 7:30 for some more insight.
I feel absolutely terrible for Richard, who's put his life on the line to help me, and he is being persecuted to such an extent. It's just insanity.
Richard Boyle is a whistleblower, there's really no debating that. But Richard Boyle isn't being pursued by the Commonwealth for blowing the whistle. He's being prosecuted for what he is alleged to have done in the lead up to making the disclosure, and that is taking photos of tax records and recording some conversations to help support his whistleblowing. As it stands today, Richard Boyle is facing decades behind bars. This highlights one of the many failings of the Public Interest Disclosure Act. It's also where things get very messy very fast. Under the Public Disclosure Act, whistleblowers are provided some protections and immunity from prosecution when making a public interest disclosure. Under the Act, in making a public interest disclosure, a person is not subject to any civil, criminal or administrative liability for the making of the public interest disclosure. It's the interpretation of this, and in particular the word making, that has allowed the Commonwealth's prosecution of Richard Boyle to continue. While Boyle's lawyers have argued that immunity in federal whistleblowing law must extend to preparatory conduct linked to the whistleblowing, that argument has been rejected by both the trial judge and the appeal judge. As Kieran Pender, senior lawyer from the Human Rights Law Centre, points out in his article in Crikey, the appeals court decision confirms a very narrow approach to whistleblower protections in Australia. Only the actual act of blowing the whistle is protected, nothing else, no matter how closely linked to the whistleblowing. Pender goes on to say that whistleblowing laws also explicitly allow whistleblowers to speak up to journalists and MPs in certain circumstances. But now, they cannot provide any documents or information that is not already in their lawful possession. The protection is only to tell a journalist about allegations of corruption, not provide any evidence. How many journalists and MPs will take a whistleblower's word for it? You can see how this is going to make life pretty hard for whistleblowers when the best they can provide in the way of evidence is a "trust me bro."
Now we're all up to speed.
Remember, it's taken roughly 8 years to get to this point. To me, it's sad that this whole case has reached a point where Richard Boyle needs to talk about a plea deal, because in my mind, you'd really only reach that stage once you've exhausted all avenues of defence, which is essentially what appears to have happened in this case. While you'd still like to think that common sense will ultimately prevail and Boyle will be able to walk away without conviction, after following this story for a while now, I'm genuinely of the view that common sense crawled off into a dark corner to die a long time ago. In an article in The Guardian, Richard Boyle's case was described as being the first major test of Australia's much criticised whistleblowing protections. If Boyle's experience to date is anything to go by, if this case was the first major test, then Australia's whistleblowing protections have well and truly failed. Since that article was written, we've seen the government decide to continue not only the prosecution of Richard Boyle, but also David McBride, who, don't forget, is serving 5 years and 8 months behind bars at the moment. Both cases, McBride's and Boyle's, point to failures of both Labor and the coalition governments to adequately protect whistleblowers in this country.
Governments, be they LNP or Labor, they hate whistleblowers. They hate people speaking up. They hate people shining a light on official misconduct. And they consistently want to punish the whistleblower, and they consistently want to send a signal to would-be whistleblowers to shut up.
As with David McBride, the Attorney-General Mark Dreyfus can step in at any time to put a stop to this prosecution if he wants to.
It's true, as the member for Clark has pointed out in his motion, that the Attorney-General has power under the Judiciary Act to discontinue proceedings.
As awkward as that may be for some people to hear or even say out loud. All that's needed is this guy and a pen. In case you had any doubt, here's a lawyer telling you the same thing.
The Attorney-General, Mark Dreyfus, KC, and the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions both have the power at any time to intervene and discontinue this case. There's no public interest in prosecuting whistleblowers. The Attorney-General knows that. Last year he intervened to end the case against Bernard Collaery, who helped expose Australia's wrongdoing in Timor.
In my personal opinion, Mark Dreyfus should be shaking Richard Boyle's hand and thanking him for shining a light on some fairly shady ATO behaviour, not prosecuting the man to the ends of the earth.
We don't need a culture of secrecy. We need a culture of disclosure. Protect whistleblowers, expand their protections and the public interest test.
Kind of miss the good old days.
Labor's first term is almost up. They may or may not get a second one, but they came to power with a clear mandate to clean up politics. They've squandered that mandate, in my opinion. Mark Dreyfus was going to strengthen whistleblower protections, but he's quite obviously failed. In my view, the least he could do at this point is set things right. For the rest of us, though, I think it's on us all not to forget whistleblowers, the risks that they take and the role that they play. What we've seen in the past 5 to 10 years is that it doesn't matter whether the Coalition or Labor are in power. Neither party are in any sort of rush to strengthen whistleblower protections, and both Labor and the Coalition are perfectly fine with prosecuting and jailing whistleblowers. In case you missed it, there's an election coming up, so it's on us, the voting public, to remind the duopoly that this sort of thing is not fine, and that we expect better.